Margaret Wilson opened her eyes at 5:30 a.m. to the familiar sound of a shower running in their master bathroom. Their Cedar Grove home was quiet save for this gentle rhythm and the distant chirping of birds announcing the spring morning. She stretched, feeling the pleasant ache in her shoulders from yesterday's charity tennis match. The calendar on her nightstand marked another busy Thursday in a life meticulously constructed over decades. By the time Margaret made her way downstairs, Thomas was already in the kitchen, his silver hair still damp, dressed in all but his tie and jacket. After 30 years as principal of Cedar Grove High School, his morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. "There she is," Thomas smiled, sliding a cup of coffee across the marble island. "I was beginning to think you might sleep in for once." "And miss our breakfast?" "Never," Margaret replied, accepting both the coffee and the quick kiss Thomas planted on her forehead. At 61, Margaret Wilson maintained the elegant bearing that had served her well throughout her career as one of the region's most respected architects. Her silver-streaked dark hair framed a face that had aged gracefully, intelligent eyes missing nothing. "The school board meeting is tonight at 7, Thomas reminded her, turning his attention to the herbs he was chopping for her omelette. "Principal Rivera mentioned they're eager to hear your thoughts on the auditorium renovation." "I'll be there," Margaret nodded, watching her husband's methodical movements. At 63, Thomas Wilson still maintained the physique of the college tennis player she'd fallen in love with, though his once auburn hair had turned distinguished gray. His steady hands and warm brown eyes behind his reading glasses conveyed the same thoughtful patience that had made him beloved by generations of students. Breakfast in their garden room had been their ritual for decades. The spring garden beyond the windows was coming alive. Every flower bed and tree on their acre property reflected Thomas's careful weekend attention. This garden had become his passion after their third and final miscarriage, 25 years ago. "Diane called yesterday," Thomas mentioned, referring to Diane Murphy, Margaret's closest friend since college and the wife of the town's head doctor. "She and Robert want us to co-chair the hospital charity gala next month." Margaret nodded, considering her schedule. "I think we can manage it. Last year we raised nearly $200,000 for the children's wing." She paused, feeling the familiar, dull ache that had softened but never completely disappeared. Their work with children's charities had become their way of channeling what might have been into something meaningful. They had met in Chicago 32 years ago, Margaret then a promising young architect, Thomas completing his master's in education. Their courtship had been deliberate, thoughtful, like everything Thomas did. It had taken him 3 months to ask her to dinner, and another year before he proposed with a vintage ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Margaret had never doubted her decision to marry Thomas, even through the devastating years of fertility treatments, specialists, and heartbreaking losses. When they finally accepted they would never have children, Thomas had been her rock. "We have each other," he'd said, holding her through the nights of grief. "And that will always be enough." And somehow, it had become enough. They moved to Cedar Grove when Thomas was offered a position at the high school. Margaret established her own architectural firm, dividing her time between local projects and occasional commissions in Chicago and New York. They had built a life rich in other ways: professional accomplishments, community leadership, deep friendships, extensive travel during summer breaks. "I saw Elizabeth Parker at the grocery store yesterday," Margaret said, sipping her coffee. "Her twins are graduating this year. Both accepted to Yale." Thomas nodded, a strange shadow crossing his face. They grew up so fast. Margaret studied her husband as he turned away to rinse his plate. Lately, she'd noticed subtle changes in Thomas, moments of distraction, occasional melancholy that seemed out of character for her typically steady, optimistic husband. At first, she'd attributed it to thoughts of his upcoming retirement, but sometimes she caught him staring at family photos in the newspaper with an intensity that unsettled her. "You seem preoccupied this morning," Margaret observed. Thomas startled slightly. "Just thinking about next year's retirement. 30 years at Cedar Grove High, it's difficult to imagine life without it." "We could travel more," Margaret suggested. "Maybe spend a semester at that villa in Tuscany you've always talked about." "Yes," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "That would be nice." As he finished dressing, Margaret noticed Thomas checking his phone, his expression changing almost imperceptibly before he quickly tucked it away. "Another crisis at school?" she asked. "Something like that," he replied, kissing her goodbye. "Don't wait up if the board meeting runs late." After Thomas left, Margaret settled at her drafting table in her home office, reviewing plans for the community center. The quiet of the house enveloped her, a quiet that had once felt like failure but had eventually become comfortable, peaceful even. They had filled their home with art, books, and music instead of children's laughter. But her mind kept returning to the strange, guarded expression she'd glimpsed on her husband's face, a look she'd rarely seen in all their years together. She remembered how he'd flinched when she'd mentioned Elizabeth Parker's twins. She dismissed the thought. After 30 years of marriage, there could be no significant secrets between them. Whatever was troubling Thomas, he would share it when he was ready. Their relationship had always been built on trust, the perfect foundation for their life together. Margaret turned back to her blueprints, pushing away the nagging feeling that something was changing in their carefully constructed world. The first subtle change Margaret noticed was in their evening routine. For the past 30 years, Thomas would grade papers or review school policies at his desk in their shared home office while Margaret worked on her architectural designs. But in the last few weeks, he'd taken to closing the door, claiming he needed quiet to concentrate on budget proposals for the next school year. One Tuesday evening in late April, Margaret knocked on the office door with a cup of tea for Thomas. When she entered, he quickly minimized whatever was on his computer screen and closed a folder on his desk. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting down the tea. "Just district paperwork," he replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Boring administrative details." Margaret nodded and retreated, but the moment stayed with her. The slight tensing of his shoulders, the flutter of his hands over the papers. 30 years of marriage had made her attuned to Thomas's body language, and something felt off. The following week, Thomas announced over breakfast that he needed to go to Chicago for a medical consultation. "What kind of consultation?" Margaret asked, immediately concerned. "Is everything all right?" Thomas stirred his coffee with unusual concentration. "Just a follow-up to my annual physical. Dr. Henderson recommended a specialist for some tests." "What tests? What specialist?" Margaret pressed. "I'll come with you." "That's not necessary," Thomas replied, his tone firmer than usual. "It's routine. Besides, you have that meeting with the Historical Preservation Committee. I can reschedule. Your health is more important." "Margaret," Thomas said, with uncharacteristic sharpness, "I'm perfectly capable of seeing a doctor on my own. Please don't make this into something it's not." The edge in his voice silenced her. In 30 years, Thomas had rarely spoken to her with anything but patience and affection. This new distance between them felt like a cold draft in a previously warm room. 2 days later, while searching for stamps in Thomas's desk, Margaret found a prescription bottle tucked behind a stack of folders. The label read spiralactone, prescribed to Thomas Wilson by a Dr. Nakamura at the Lakeside Medical Center in Chicago. Margaret had never heard Thomas mention this doctor or medication. A quick internet search revealed it was used for various conditions, including high blood pressure and certain hormonal issues. That night, she casually asked, "How's your blood pressure been lately?" Thomas looked up from his book. "Fine. Why?" "Just wondering," Margaret said. "Robert mentioned seeing a rise in hypertension cases at his practice." "My numbers were perfect at my last checkup," Thomas replied, returning to his book. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The prescription bottle was dated just 3 weeks ago. The following day, while using Thomas's laptop to print some documents, her printer had run out of ink. Margaret noticed an email notification pop up on the screen. The sender was Lakeside Medical, and it was addressed to Theresa Wilson. Assuming it was a typo, she clicked on it without thinking. "Dear Ms. Wilson," the email began. "This is a reminder of your appointment on May 15th with Dr. Nakamura for hormone level monitoring." Margaret stared at the screen, confusion washing over her. The email continued with details about preparation for blood work and a reminder to bring a list of current medications. Had the clinic confused Thomas with another patient? But the email had come directly to his personal account. She closed the email, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private, though she wasn't sure what. That evening, Margaret checked their joint bank account online and scrolled back through the transactions. For the past 6 months, there had been regular payments to Lakeside Medical Center, $350 every 6 weeks. Thomas had always handled their finances, with Margaret reviewing statements only occasionally. Now she wondered what else she had missed. The next morning, over breakfast, Margaret approached the subject cautiously. "I noticed some charges from a medical center in Chicago. Is that related to your upcoming appointment?" Thomas's spoon clinked against his coffee cup. "Yes, it's for some specialized tests. Nothing to worry about." "What kind of tests require so many visits? Are you sure you're all right?" Thomas sighed. "Margaret, please. It's a personal matter I'm working through with my doctor." "Personal?" Margaret echoed. "Since when do we have personal medical matters separate from each other?" "Everyone is entitled to some privacy," Thomas said, rising from the table. "Even after 30 years of marriage." That afternoon, Margaret met Diane Murphy for lunch at the Cedar Grove Cafe. After 30 minutes of discussing the upcoming charity gala, Margaret finally voiced her concerns. "I think Thomas is keeping something from me," she admitted, turning her water glass slowly. "He's seeing some specialist in Chicago, taking medication he hasn't mentioned, and he's become secretive." Diane's eyebrows rose. "That doesn't sound like Thomas." "Exactly," Margaret said. "In 30 years, we've never kept health issues from each other. And yesterday, I found an email addressed to Theresa Wilson about hormone monitoring. Maybe it was sent to the wrong person." Diane suggested. "It was in his personal email account," Margaret replied. "And he dismissed my concerns as a personal matter." "Have you considered?" Diane hesitated. "Could there be someone else?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "Not Thomas. Never." That night, Margaret prepared Thomas's favorite meal, grilled salmon with dill sauce and roasted vegetables. She opened a bottle of their special occasion wine, hoping to create an atmosphere where he might feel comfortable sharing whatever was troubling him. The dinner began pleasantly enough, with Thomas complimenting the food and discussing the day's events at school. But when Margaret gently steered the conversation toward his upcoming Chicago trip, his demeanor changed instantly. "I thought we had settled this," he said, putting down his fork. "I have some health matters I'm addressing. It's nothing serious, but it is private." "We've never had private health matters before," Margaret countered. "We've shared everything." "Well, perhaps that was a mistake," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. "Some things are better kept to oneself." The statement hung between them like a wall. They finished their meal in uncomfortable silence. Later that night, as Thomas slept, Margaret made a decision. Whatever was happening in Chicago was changing her husband, creating a distance she couldn't bear. Next Thursday, when Thomas left for his appointment, she would follow him. After 30 years together, she deserved to know the truth. The morning of Thomas's appointment dawned gray and overcast, matching Margaret's mood as she packed a small overnight bag. She had told Thomas she was visiting a client in Milwaukee, the first significant lie of their marriage. Thomas had seemed relieved at her absence, another small cut to her heart. They'd parted with a perfunctory kiss, the distance between them now a physical reality. Margaret gave Thomas a 40-minute head start before following in her own car. The drive to Chicago took just under 2 hours, the familiar skyline appearing through sheets of light rain. She had memorized the address of Lakeside Medical Center from their bank statements, programming it into her GPS. The facility was located in a modern building near the University Medical Campus, its glass facade reflecting the churning gray clouds above. Margaret parked across the street, watching as Thomas's black sedan pulled into the medical center's parking garage. She waited 15 minutes before following, her heart pounding against her ribs. This felt surreal, following her husband of 30 years like a detective in some tawdry crime drama. Yet something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, and she needed to understand what. The medical center's lobby was bright and airy, with abstract paintings adorning the walls. A large directory listed dozens of medical practices. Margaret scanned it quickly, noting that Lakeside Medical Center occupied the entire 5th floor. She took the elevator up, rehearsing what she would say. At the reception desk, Margaret claimed to be checking in for her husband, Thomas Wilson. The receptionist found no record of his appointment. Margaret retreated to the waiting area, partially hidden by a large potted plant. 20 minutes passed before she saw Thomas emerge from a hallway, speaking with a nurse. "Hormone levels are stabilizing nicely," the nurse was saying. "Dr. Nakamura is pleased with your progress, but wants to adjust your dosage slightly." "The hot flashes have been more frequent," Thomas replied, his voice low. Margaret's mind was spinning. Hormone levels? Hot flashes? Thomas scheduled another appointment for 6 weeks later, then headed toward the elevator. Margaret approached the receptionist again, asking about the clinic's specialization. Lakeside Medical Center is a comprehensive facility specializing in transgender health services. We provide hormone therapy, surgical consultations, and ongoing care for transitioning individuals. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thanked the receptionist mechanically and made her way outside, her legs unsteady beneath her. Margaret followed Thomas to a modest hotel in the University District. She waited in the lobby, watching as he checked in and headed to the elevator. Approaching the front desk, she explained that her husband had her medication in his bag. "Room 312. Do you need a key?" the clerk asked, hardly looking up. "No, thank you. I'll just knock." Margaret waited until the clerk was distracted before taking the elevator to the 3rd floor. She stood outside room 312, listening. The shower was running. Heart pounding, she tried the door handle. It opened. Thomas had never been careful about hotel security. The room was neat, Thomas's overnight bag open on the luggage rack. Margaret moved quietly, conscious of the running water in the bathroom. She rifled through the bag, finding nothing unusual until her fingers touched something hard at the bottom. A small metal box secured with a combination lock. She tried their anniversary date, 0422. The lock clicked open. Inside lay documents carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The first was a birth certificate for Theresa and Reynolds, born in Evanston, Illinois, 35 years before. The date matched Thomas's birthday. Beneath it were medical records from a clinic in San Francisco, detailing procedures for gender reassignment performed just before Thomas and Margaret had met. Photos showed a progression. A young woman with Thomas's eyes and jawline gradually transforming into the man Margaret had married. At the bottom of the box was a worn photograph of a younger Thomas, or Theresa, standing beside an elderly woman. On the back, in faded blue ink, "To my daughter Theresa, always remember who you truly are. Love, Mom." Margaret replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, her hands trembling. She slipped out of the room just as the shower stopped running. Back in her car, Margaret sat motionless, trying to process what she'd discovered. The pieces were falling into place, the secretive behavior, the medications, the emails addressed to Theresa. Her husband of 30 years had been born a woman. There was one person who might know more. Michael Sullivan had been Thomas's friend before Margaret, the best man at their wedding who had drifted away over the years, settling in Chicago's northern suburbs. Margaret had his address from last year's Christmas card. Michael's surprise at seeing her on his doorstep quickly gave way to wariness. They sat in his living room, the air heavy with unspoken knowledge. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" Michael finally said, his voice quiet. Margaret nodded. "Thomas was born Theresa." Michael sighed deeply. "I've carried this secret for so long. Tom made me promise never to tell anyone, especially you." "Why especially me?" "He was afraid of losing you. By the time you met, the transition was complete. He wanted to leave Theresa in the past." "But she was never really gone, was she?" Michael looked at her with sympathy. "No. Some parts of ourselves we can never fully leave behind." Margaret drove back to Cedar Grove in a state of numbness, the windshield wipers beating a hypnotic rhythm against the strengthening rain. The truth she had discovered in Chicago sat in her mind like a foreign object, unexamined, dangerous. She couldn't allow herself to think about it fully, not yet. Not while navigating the slick highways through the gathering storm. By the time she arrived home, the skies had darkened prematurely, thunder rolling across the horizon. The house was empty and quiet, just as she had left it. Margaret moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects that suddenly seemed to belong to a different life. The wedding portrait on the mantel. The antique clock Thomas had given her for their 20th anniversary. The garden visible through the window, which Thomas had planted and tended with such care. She opened a bottle of wine and poured herself a glass. A strange clarity was settling over her. She would confront Thomas tonight. She would hear the truth from his own lips. She deserved that much. She set the formal dining table with their best china and crystal, lighting candles and preparing Thomas's favorite meal. How many meals had she prepared for him over the years? How many times had she played the role of devoted wife while he concealed his fundamental truth from her? At precisely 7 o'clock, she heard Thomas's key in the lock. He called out her name, surprise evident in his voice. "In the dining room," she replied, her voice unnaturally calm. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness as he took in the formal table setting, the candles, the bottle of wine. "What's the occasion?" "Sit down, Thomas. Or should I call you Theresa?" The blood drained from his face. He stood frozen for a moment before slowly pulling out a chair and sinking into it. "How did you?" "I followed you to Chicago," Margaret said, pouring him a glass of wine with steady hands. "I saw the clinic. I found the lockbox in your hotel room." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were filled with resignation. "I never wanted you to find out this way." "How did you want me to find out? After another 30 years? Or never?" Margaret's voice remained level, but a tremor had begun deep inside her. "Were you ever going to tell me that my husband was born a woman?" Thunder cracked overhead, as if punctuating her question. "I was born female," Thomas acknowledged quietly. "But I've lived as Thomas for 35 years. I completed my transition before we met." "And you never thought this was something I should know? That I had a right to know?" "I was afraid," he admitted. "When we met, I had finally become who I was always meant to be. I was afraid if you knew the truth, you wouldn't see me as a real man." "A real man," Margaret repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "A real man who could never father children." Thomas flinched. "I know how much you wanted children. I wanted them too." "Did you?" Margaret's voice rose. "Or was that just another lie? You knew it couldn't happen, and you let me go through all those fertility treatments, all those specialists, all those years of hope and disappointment." "I didn't know how to tell you," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Each year that passed, it became harder. You let me believe there was something wrong with me." The words tore from Margaret's throat. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? The shame I carried? The failure I felt as a woman?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "As a woman. While all along, you were the woman." The storm reached its apex outside, rain lashing against the windows. Inside, 30 years of repressed truth boiled to the surface. "Everything about our marriage has been a lie," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "Every moment, every memory, all based on a fundamental deception." "No," Thomas stood too, reaching for her hand across the table. "My love for you was never a lie. The life we built together was real." Margaret withdrew her hand. "Real? Like your body? Like the children we were never going to have?" She moved away from the table, her mind racing back through their years together. The fertility treatments, the miscarriages, the grief counseling. Thomas had held her through all of it, assuring her they would get through it together. All while knowing the true reason they couldn't conceive. She remembered the darkest days of her depression, when she had felt her body had betrayed her, when she had questioned her very womanhood. Thomas had been there, patient and supportive, never once revealing that he understood more about gender identity than she could have imagined. "You watched me suffer," she said, her voice hollow. "You watched me blame myself, hate my body, question who I was as a woman, while you kept your secret." "I was trying to protect you," Thomas insisted. "And yes, selfishly, I was trying to protect myself too. I was afraid of losing you." "You never had me," Margaret replied coldly. "The real me would have had a choice about whether to marry a transgender man." Margaret moved to the cabinet where her father's hunting rifle was kept. She hadn't touched it in years, but her hands remembered the combination to the gun safe. She wasn't thinking clearly now. She only knew she needed something solid to hold on to, something real in a world that had suddenly lost all definition. "Margaret," Thomas said, his voice careful as he watched her remove the rifle. "Please put that down. We need to talk about this calmly." "Calmly?" Margaret laughed, a brittle sound. "You want me to be calm about discovering my entire marriage has been built on lies?" "Not lies," Thomas insisted, taking a cautious step toward her. "I am the same person you've always known. I just wasn't born in the body that matched who I am." Margaret raised the rifle, not pointing it at Thomas but holding it across her body like a barrier between them. "Stop. Don't come any closer." A tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, followed by a blinding flash of lightning. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness save for the intermittent flashes from the storm outside. In that moment of disorientation, Margaret's finger tightened reflexively on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, momentarily drowning out even the thunder. When the next lightning flash came, Margaret saw Thomas on the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The rifle fell from her hands with a clatter. "Thomas," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh God, Thomas." His eyes fluttered open, finding hers in the darkness. "Margaret," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, should have told you. Everything else was real. My love was always real." She cradled his head in her lap, pressing her hand futilely against the wound. "Don't talk. I'm going to call an ambulance." Thomas's hand weakly caught hers. "Too late," he whispered. "Listen. I never regretted being Thomas, being your husband, best years of my life." His breathing became more labored, each word a struggle. "Forgive yourself," he managed. "I forgive you." In the flickering lightning, Margaret watched the light fade from her husband's eyes. She held him as the storm raged on, 30 years of shared life ending in one impulsive, irreversible moment. Margaret sat on the floor holding Thomas's body until the storm passed, her mind vacant of thought, her body numb. When awareness finally returned, she reached mechanically for the phone and dialed 911. "I've shot my husband," she said, her voice hollow. "He's dead." The house soon filled with flashing lights and uniforms. Margaret answered questions in monosyllables, moving as if underwater. She didn't resist when they handcuffed her, didn't flinch when they read her rights. One part of her observed it all from a distance, as if watching a movie about someone else's life. "Margaret Wilson, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Wilson." The interrogation room at the Cedar Grove police station was small and cold. Margaret had known many of these officers for decades. Now they looked at her with a mixture of professional detachment and personal betrayal. The town's respected architect had killed the beloved high school principal. It was incomprehensible. "It was an accident," she told them, the only words she could manage. "The storm, the lights went out. I didn't mean to pull the trigger." Days blurred into weeks. Margaret was charged with second-degree murder. The prosecutor mentioned the formal dinner setting, the retrieval of the rifle, evidence of premeditation. Her attorney argued for manslaughter, citing the emotional trauma of her discovery and the chaos of the storm. In her cell at the county detention center, Margaret existed in a fog of grief and guilt. She couldn't stop seeing Thomas's eyes as the life drained from them, couldn't stop hearing his final words of forgiveness. Diane visited after the first month, her face etched with concern and confusion. "Everyone in town is talking," she said, sitting across from Margaret in the visitation room. About Thomas, about what you found out. Michael told the police everything. Margaret nodded dully. I keep thinking about what Thomas must have gone through, Diane continued tentatively. All those years ago, making that decision. The courage it must have taken. He lied to me for 30 years, Margaret said, but the anger that had fueled those words on that stormy night had burned out, leaving only ashes. Yes, Diane acknowledged. But he also loved you for 30 years. A week later, a package arrived from Michael. A bundle of letters Thomas had written to him over the years. The earliest dated from before Margaret and Thomas had met. The most recent was from just a month ago. Margaret read them chronologically, following Thomas's journey through his own words. His joy at finding Margaret. His fear that she would discover his past. His guilt over their inability to have children. His periodic consideration of telling her the truth, always abandoned out of fear of losing her. I live in constant terror of discovery, one letter from their 5th year of marriage read, but also in constant joy of being loved by her. Sometimes I convince myself that who I was born as doesn't matter, only who I am now, with her. Memories surfaced as Margaret read, Thomas teaching neighborhood children to garden. Thomas holding her through her father's long illness and death. Thomas celebrating her professional achievements with genuine pride. Small kindnesses and shared joys accumulated over decades. On the night before her sentencing, Margaret sat on her narrow bed, looking at their wedding photograph. They had been so young, so hopeful. She traced Thomas's face with her finger. The person in the photograph was the person she had loved for 30 years, regardless of the body he had been born with. Her attorney had prepared her to expect 15 to 20 years. She would be an old woman when she was released, if she lived that long. A guard appeared with an envelope. Special delivery, approved by the warden. Inside was a letter from Michael, and with it, a yellowed piece of paper, Thomas's last will and testament, written the day after Margaret had left for Chicago. If something happens to me, it read, please tell Margaret that I was finally going to tell her everything. That I couldn't bear the distance between us anymore. That whatever happened afterward, the truth had to be better than the fear of discovery that had haunted me for 30 years. Margaret pressed the paper to her heart, tears flowing freely for the first time since that night. I knew you, Thomas, she whispered to the empty cell. Maybe not all of you, but the parts that mattered most? Those I knew. Those I loved.